All right, so there's various topics, things, every day. So I've been switching gears. Well, not exactly. There's just a lot of different things to incorporate at different times. And so I'm trying to get up to speed on things that are going on with Iran and the other connections of developments in the region. And this topic of Mecca joint defense, and I believe then it incorporates Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Turkey. And so looking at the possible changes in the area in reference. So anyway, just kind of and then recent events pertaining to Israel being at odds with Turkey and the development of different types of defense in the region. Also just other things that influence the way people will view things on the world stage or our political discourse, and how it kind of does or does not keep us in gridlock or consensus or seeking directions for where to go with these things. Anyway, so there's kind of like the domestic home front negotiations, the political parties, the various approaches and methodology, and the global interaction on the world stage. I was thinking of, like on some basic measure, we kind of go through these stages where people are leveraging other people among these like systemic issues and politicizing things. And for me, I try to step back and focus on, because a lot of times in the public sphere, people will kind of leverage different stages of technicality against other groups and whatnot. And it seems like what kind of functions there is that when we live in a skewed system, there is this sense where everything is a little bit skewed, and we're made susceptible to inaccuracies or less than ideal situations and whatnot. And so in some way, certain versions, like you've probably heard this a lot of times if you're negotiating an advocacy and like the political home front, it gets into religious rhetoric as well. And there are certain religious interpretations that go into some of these measures. And among some of them is this idea that, well, everything is wrong. Everybody is guilty. And in some ways that does function to some degree. It is useful to some degree to say there is an accuracy to it. Like, we're all born into a skewed system. And so, we're made susceptible to it. And so then we have to function through degrees of like that skewed sense. But then on another note, at times when we're trying to make improvements, that also gets used as this technicality of like almost like diffusing the action for improvements by these suggestions like, well, everything is wrong, like kind of giving a sameness, equivalency to everything. And so there's just different ways that it can function, right? It'll get into these kind of theoretical approaches like, well, what really is wrong anyway? Or, certain corrective measures, they're just, it's relative, right? It depends on the situation. And there's also some of that too as well. So it kind of really gets down into the rabbit hole of things. So then you kind of get into the philosophical territory where, like different philosophers and different ones then start talking about stuff pertaining to similarities, say like the moral landscape, right? The moral landscape, Sam Harris talks about this as well. This is why it also got into the territory of religion and debate and atheists. And so it kind of gets into like, okay, we have to have some standard of morality, some standard of improvement. So his proposal in the moral landscape involved those types of negotiations, that we can look at things in our shared living, the landscape by which we live from and share, and the standard by which us as created beings can increase our wellness or inhibit our wellness. And there's some degrees of us as a sensory being that we can gauge levels of what is more harmful and less harmful and stuff like that. And so he does introduce a type of criteria for levels of improvement, a basis by which we can function through some standard for life and relationships and quality of relationships and hindering and whatnot. Along these lines, he also talks about like a variety of like philosophical approaches to these things, and to what degree are we susceptible to certain influences that we're born into, this, that, and the other. So my philosophical side, I really appreciate some of those like mental riddles. I like those things. Some people don't. I realize over the years trying to chat with people and whatnot, for some they just don't want to think about that, which I respect. That I understand. There's even times where I'm just kind of like, all right, I don't want to overthink this other thing, I'm gonna take a break on that. But there are times when I take a deep dive into that murkiness. So anyway, I'm just kind of thinking about that, and this idea, I think some religious groups will maybe resist Sam Harris's criteria along those lines because they tend to associate it with being an atheistic approach to minimizing the value of religion, which I tend to not see it that way. A lot of people would combat Sam Harris along the lines of things like only have morality with God and this, that, and the other. I mean, there is some basis to that in the sense of like what is required for his standard of morality is that there's a sense of consciousness, the animated force of life, that then inhabits our bodies by which we function through, and then we perceive then it goes into degrees of our sensory perception, our experience of life and whatnot. So there is some sense that there is that requirement of the stage of consciousness of life of God. But I think what people kind of mean when they put the religious approach to it is that they make claims like you can, like if you don't accept God in these certain types of like isolated frameworks, then you are not really practicing love, or you're not really, so it kind of gets into the religiosity and, all of these things, which I don't tend to agree along those lines. That kind of goes into the sense of like, improper frameworks of battling over the ideas of God and whatnot, because people definitely can gauge these ideas of love and life and appreciation and sensory perception. And, that's even in scripture where it says something to the effect of like, people would have practiced some of what seems to be the spirit of the law without having even known it. Something to that effect. So without having even known it, in some of these things, people just in the experience of life happen upon these like interactions. So that just seems very reasonable to say. Anyway, though, so we kind of get into these like, and that like that's a whole other conversation for later. I do think, like I do a lot of work within scriptural interpretation. I think there's better ways to interpret it that are not these leveraged or control measures of systemic force. So this is also another reason why over the years I've been familiar with a lot of these discussions and approaches. This is also why sometimes I like some portions of the atheistic argument. I've gained a lot from their contribution, from the arguing points, and I tend to think that in some ways some are legitimately asking honest questions, and then that from there you kind of like work through. It's really helped refine the way and challenge the way I also just think about scripture, and I feel like I hold scripture to a standard where it should live up to some of the things that we see in life and whatnot. There should be some accuracy that aligns there. Anyway, though, because of some of these over the years, I've also gotten into battles with a religiosity type approach to things. I've gotten into a lot of different versions of shutting down or diffusing the ability for growth conversations in society, honest conversations, through systemic type leverage and force. And so over time, it has been a part of me developing my framework of approach, which I keep making reference to, like systems theory. And systems theory in the sense of like even interpreting scripture that way. So I do tend to think that systems are a lot of the language by which the scriptures make more sense or are understood better in terms of looking at systems that we're born into, skewed systems that affect us, skewed systems that we have to enact and practice and whatnot. And so in some ways, you also look at the systems that we're born into, the skewed sense of what we're born into also, tends to carry the weight by which is an improper power mechanism imposed on people. And so people can get into systems and misuse powers and levers. There's even a societal investment in the way systems can function, how people invest and use mechanisms of system force. And so I think in a lot of ways, it's also mapping out how are people improperly utilizing systemic force. And even at times when people are using activism, so there's a religiosity aspect of improper system force. There's an activism approach to improper system force. There's a variety of these things. There's also times where people, because we're caught up in systemic apparatuses that skew our otherwise ability to enact more in line with our ideals, there could also be improper technicalities. So many, basically, one of the main functions is for a lot of things is that there are some that intentionally invest and weaponize systemic apparatuses that are skewed in order to control other people. And so they're not always negotiating in good faith. They're not always looking for what's the proper standard of corrective measure. And at times they can become so encapsulated or animated by the systemic skewed sense of leverage. They tap into a type of power over other people, and they no longer really want the spirit of change, nor recognize the spirit of change, nor recognize the spirit of life or a corrective standard. They simply can just become very weaponized, and they actually then need the skewed system. They're involved in the skewed system. They perpetuate and invest a skewed system because that's what they tap into functioning through. Whereas it's different when people are literally looking at what helps change those mechanisms to diffuse the improper power of a system structure and seek for a spirit of receptivity to corrective measures, and also being equipped to do that, right? There's a lot of ways that people can tap into technicalities to cloak themselves in, to prop themselves up, to wage a type of egotistical battle with no intention to really change the actual system. No spirit of actual alignment or connection intended there. And so even when we get to this point, though, we get people throwing around the idea of pretending to be about that when they're not. And they know that they oftentimes are situated from a systemic power, and they try to use technicalities against people that they know are increasing progress within imperfect conditions, right? And so there's a lot of times where it gets into mind games with systemic powers and whatnot. And you see this in politics, and you see this in slander type media approaches or leverage control measures where people are invested in massive amounts of power in the system, and they try to piece people apart. They try to get into their mind and piece them apart, portraying imperfections, things that they're not really free to have changed otherwise. They even wage improper standards against people that are trying to increase people's livability. And if they want to get into a power struggle with them, they'll nitpick at the imperfect ways that they've tried to develop more access for people's lives. And so that also happens as well, where you start realizing some people don't intend to be about actual change, nor do they appreciate nor recognize the spirit of people increasing life for other groups. They just become absorbed in their own hostilities and whatnot. And that, historically there could be good reason for that. But at the same time, it's not the change that people need, nor would it lead to the change that people actually need. They get to the point where they would rather, at some point play the corrupt game rather than really do the work for legitimate change. And they'll try to cover themselves by intentionally undermining various opportunities just for some kind of their own, whether you say egotistical power struggle or what have you. It's complicated because a lot of people, people are just complex characters and none of us are perfect. And so there's always this sense where we could maybe through our own ignorance be perpetuating things, or other groups slander. There's a lot of money in slander politics and whatnot. But the thing is like people always also do corrupt things. Some people in these entities, they, it could be they just don't even have any better ideas and play like a really toxic game of systemic power and leverage over each other. But for me, I literally am trying to seek what is the actual change function, not just getting into those types of measures. It does get to the point where some people in powerful positions with powerful messaging and leverage can really hinder other people's lives. And they have no intention about seeing potential for progress. That's not even what they seem to be functioning through. Anyway, you see that a lot even in like the scriptural story, where various ones intentionally misuse words, language, timing. I mean, the devil character does that, right? He misuses like timing, words, phrases, references to dismantle actual progress. He seems like this character that can recognize areas for potential progress, knows how to get people in the system to piece people apart. So you kind of see that in the story as well. It's useful because that is, even if you're looking at secular sciences of psychology or human behavior, it is something that you need to recognize, that when people get into these certain unhealed practices or whatnot, they can take on those types of measures or portrayal. Anyway, it gets really complicated. People know, like the human interaction, the unhealedness, the skewed sense by which we are forced to live among, makes us susceptible to imperfections. Anybody that's ever been in any type of leadership probably knows that there's a certain perfected standard that people leverage against themselves and others, because a lot of like guilt or other situations is usually a standard that you don't know how to master for yourself, or you do know how to master it and you've chosen to improperly master it as a control mechanism against others, or you don't know how to master it and so you project that inability for a better idea or a better approach onto others, and so you're functioning through projecting your own issues on other people. Sometimes it really is that other people are also just playing a skewed game and you're playing a skewed game, and you recognize that in them because that's what you've grown to recognize in pattern sequence, possibly. There's a lot of different things, complicated. But anyway, there are times too where people just don't always recognize, in the midst of imperfection, some leaders or various ones. It depends. There's also like corrupt leadership as well. But there are often times where people are trying to negotiate within the situation they find themselves in, and you have to kind of ask yourself, is there progress being made here? And so that's hard for us to do. It's hard for us to understand and differentiate, especially when we live in a day of very weaponized information. A lot of the warfare now is fueled by the weaponization of marketing perceptions and investment and information. Way to get your body to attack itself is improper messaging, even within our internal bodies, right? And so then we think like, what is alignment then, or how do we even begin? What could we think about? So I was imagining this. I was thinking about this, and at some level we look at. There's a lot of things on the world stage, a lot of unsavory characters, a lot of different ones where people can nitpick at their imperfections, or this group did this and that group did this, that, and the other. And it just gets into like slander all over the place, and then people get fueled and angry about it. Then they undercut people with certain systemic leverage, and they, da-da-da-da-da. But what, even on a very simple note, what is behind the backdrop when I'm thinking about some of these like characters, that these countries and making negotiations and whatnot, where I know they're not perfect. I know they've been involved in the weaponization of things back and forth. Maybe they've been put in that position, all of these things all across the board. And so something that I'm thinking about when I'm imagining these negotiations is we have to also try to think, what is the actual corrective measure? Not are these people being, not bringing a perfect standard to everything that they've ever done or said, or, what have you, because at some level you have to also ask yourself, are those a function of resisting the systemic corruption? And a lot of times it is, all the way down to some degree. There's also the question of, are they situated in a place where they have major influence over controlling, perpetuating the skewed systemic leverage? And a lot of times, and that does differentiate between characters, there's some people that definitely have more power and influence over intentionally skewing and investing in a power to skew the system to leverage over others in a control weaponization. But to ask, some, I think, simple things to ask is, do these people have representation? So if we're talking about across the board negotiating with other nations and legitimacy and stuff like that, do these people have, getting to asking ourselves, aside from all of these other things, don't like this group or this country or this just pause for a second and maybe have a list of what's the actual corrective standard here, though? What would an actual corrective standard look like? Otherwise, we're still going to be stuck in weaponizing a skewed system, and then we don't get anywhere from there except perpetuating a skewed system, which generates the continuation of these conflicts. So then what is a corrective measure? So some things could be something to the effect of do these groups have representation at the table? Do they have legitimate representation in the legalities of negotiation at the table? So then you can kind of start there, and then you can ask, why wouldn't they? Or in what way do they? Along those lines, is there a standard for universal human rights applied? In what way and how? And in another way, how are they to invest to develop economically? And are we free among global interactions from economics simply being an improper, unsustainable weaponization of improper extraction, resource extraction? And then we can be honest about that. We could say, well, we don't want to talk about that, because then if we talk about it, we legitimize people blocking our ability to have weaponized extraction. Here's the thing, even though people know, just name the thing. Let's just try to at least legitimately name it. Even if you're going to go and, I'm not saying you should, but even if you plan to go and undermine it and still weaponize extraction, let's just name it. What is driving the actual motivation for weaponized extraction? And is it sustainable? A lot of times this weaponized extraction is not really sustainable. It doesn't really build longevity for certain nations. And so so we can talk all over the place about, what does sustainability look like? What is what actually helps generate and build healthier, aligned nations among a network of nations? And then we could say, what's getting in the way of that? So then we can prioritize. At least we could start having the conversation. We could say, oh, well, a lot of the unsustainable weaponized extraction is driven by what? People will say, oh, it's greed, or it's the pace by which society demands of us, or maybe they'll say it's the war machine, the trillion dollar war machine that causes people to look the other way and weaponize unsustainable extraction, resource extraction. And then we can start imagining, what would we do otherwise? We can at least start imagining what we would do otherwise. Because if we don't, and it's not saying it's this utopian idea we're always going to be at war, whatever. I just, for one, don't think that's the case. There's plenty of countries where they're not continuously at war, and some of these wars are just profoundly unnecessary. And so I do think that it's within our grasp to imagine diminishing the idea for these excessive wars. There's so many countries in the world that do have the ability for these interactions, but then the warfare machine causes so many stages of ripple effects. It's like the warfare machine, the instability of systems, the instability of access domestically, which cause all of these other fractured ways of weaponized scheming and investment. So how do we fix that? How do we align that? How do we even just name it and have the conversation, even if groups are going to still do it? Or what are the stages of having a real, confronting that conversation and saying, we can't, okay, we can name it, but what are the stages to get out of it reasonably, because it's already there. There's already levels of threat. And so then that's where we start having those negotiations of what it looks like. Also, among nations, there's other practicalities as to once we make those corrective measures, once people are invited to the table, once there's, like an approach for better forms of sustainable development in the network of nations, then we can look at what does it mean for representation within the replicating of these relationships through education. And, looking at some of those things. So I feel like across the board, we're talking about those. And also in the midst of it, how do we then build systems that help us to have a level of, balanced, healthy access to our basic needs and stuff like that. And I think then that can help people kind of get out of these other peripheral battles that they keep getting in, where what it kind of seems to get into is when there's a skewed system and people are weaponizing different sections of the peripheral of the skewed system. They're just basically, it's kind of like even in a small scale when you get in fights with others, when people battle other people and there's not really the corrective measure of what they're trying to get to, the standard of what they're trying to correct for, it turns into stuff like, well, you're ugly then, or, well, I saw you eat, you ate this other thing the other day, you're not perfect either, or, this, that, and the other. And it's like, okay, maybe so, maybe I could improve on this, that, and the other, but that's not really what we're talking about. And so you just find that people start trying to leverage other people's resources to basic life in some form or another. And that's usually when people are utilizing the vulnerabilities of the skewed system that are imposed upon us, and we express it in a variety of different ways. We express that imposed, improper imposed scarcity and leverage against others, and signal for that because there's this weaponization of signaling, imposing the vulnerability onto other people. And so then we have to behaviorally look at that, okay, if it's causing this to come out where people have these imposed vulnerabilities on various ones, and then we deflect. How do we get to where we try to have a better vision of what we're actually trying to do instead of the blame game, instead of just the blame game? I mean, there is a time where it's not like we're not, there is a time where you're trying to differentiate those things where it's there are legitimate things to say, there are legitimate comparisons to make, along with having a corrective vision and things as well. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that for now. I was just kind of talking about that. I think maybe over the course of the next month or so, I'm not sure. We'll just kind of see. I'm kind of thinking that I will try to involve in thinking about these nation building, city building, various components and stuff. I'm still just kind of working through this systems approach to things. There's other things though, major issues that come up, and then I spend time focusing on those, and then also just other things going on. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. It was just kind of on my mind, and so I think this goes into the whole section of looking at corrective measures within systems, nations, communities, political goals or emphasis and stuff like that. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that.